Hi, I'm Nicholas Paul Breisowitz, the Director of Development here at the Long Now Foundation, and I want to begin tonight's program by letting you know how much we appreciate your support for our work. Long Now is a nonprofit organization, and every one of our projects and programs is entirely funded by members and donors like you, so thank you for helping us foster long-term thinking. We believe that civilization scale challenges call for this kind of civilization scale thinking, and this has been an especially challenging year for so many people and so many organizations, including ours. If you're able, please consider making a special donation to our annual fundraising campaign. You can make an online donation in just minutes by visiting longnow.org/support. By making a tax-deductible gift to the Long Now Foundation, you'll not only be helping an organization directly affected by this civilization scale challenge, but you'll be helping us help everyone get better at addressing all such civilization scale challenges. Learn more at longnow.org/support. And please don't forget to ask your employer if they have a charitable gift matching program that could double or even triple your impact on long-term thinking. Thank you again for all your support. Enjoy the seminar.
Hello, I'm Alexander Rose, the Executive Director here at Long Now. We are coming to you from the Interval here in San Francisco, where James Nestor and I will watch the pre-recorded talk with you all and stay on to answer questions afterward. Many of you may remember James from his talk he gave here at the Interval on the way humans can hold their breath for tens of minutes at a time and how that ability came from our underwater ancestry. In his most recent book, James takes us on a deep dive in a very different way into the way that we actually breathe and how that has been affected by modern agriculture and dentistry. Welcome, James Nestor.
Thank you, Xander. Several years ago, I came here and spoke at the Long Now Foundation about the human connection to the ocean. I talked about magnetoreception, this kind of natural form of GPS that allows sharks and whales and even humans to navigate the world without a map. I talked about echolocation and how cetaceans and people too can actually see without ever opening our eyes. And I talked about these people, freedivers. Athletes who had honed the mammalian dive reflexes that all marine mammals share and use them to dive hundreds of feet deep on a single breath of air. When I asked these freedivers how they could do what they did, they told me it was easy. Anyone in reasonable health could do it. All you had to do was master the art of breathing. It was only by really learning how to breathe that we could survive underwater for 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes at a time and plummet to such extreme depths. But these freedivers told me something else. They told me that the art of breathing extended beyond just deep diving. They told me about a man who'd been injected with the bacterial endotoxin E. coli, then breathed in a rhythmic pattern to stimulate his immune system and destroy the toxins within minutes. They told me about a woman who'd overcome decades of autoimmune diseases by simply changing the way she breathed. And they told me about an 85-year-old who'd rediscovered an ancient practice to superheat himself and sit in the snow for hours without ever getting hypothermia or frostbite, again, using only his breath. All of this sounded insane, of course, and I look forward to finding these charlatans and exposing them. But as I began digging more deeply into the art of breathing, after I spent months and months reading through scientific studies and talking to experts in the field, I discovered that these impossible stories were actually true. Breathing was this extraordinary tool we could all use to hack into otherwise autonomic functions. We could breathe in ways to control our nervous system, shift our brain states, even correct our skeleture. Each of us takes in about 30 pounds of air in and out of our bodies every single day, far more than we eat and drink. The new science of breathing was showing us that how we took in all of that air and how we exhaled it determined so much of our health, our lifespan, and our human potential. How we breathe was in many ways as important as what we ate or how much we exercised. It really was a missing pillar of health. The experts I began working with told me something else, that most of us are breathing all wrong. Now, I'd been breathing my whole life, as have all of you, and I thought I'd been doing it well enough. After all, I'm still here, I'm still alive. But breathing, it turns out, is not a binary practice. It's not just if we do it or if we don't do it. It's how we do it that's so important. And so many of us have forgotten how to breathe healthily. About 9% of the US population suffers from asthma. About 16 million of us suffer from COPD. It's the third leading cause of death. About half of us snore. About 20% of us suffer from nightly asphyxiation, known as sleep apnea. This list goes on and on and on. These respiratory problems and other poor breathing habits can exacerbate, or in some cases cause, a laundry list of serious health issues. Increased risk of stroke, ADHD, heart disease. There were even links between poor breathing and metabolic problems like diabetes. So how did this happen? How have humans become so divorced from our most basic biological function? The answers, I was told, could be found in ancient human skulls. It turns out that the pathway through which humans take in and exhale air has changed dramatically in the past few centuries, because the human face has dramatically changed over the past few centuries, and for the worst. Wait, what? I'd always learned in school that evolution is a straight line forward of progress. It's all about survival of the fittest and Darwinism and all that. But as I waded deeper into this research, I learned that that interpretation of evolution is wrong. Evolution means change, and life can change for better or for worse. Take, for instance, the concept of natural selection. Natural selection does not produce organisms perfectly suited to their environments. Instead, natural selection produces a range of traits that allow a species to be good enough to survive. We just need to be good enough to pass on our genes to the next generation. This helps explain why humans have grown more obese, why we've grown more myopic, why we've grown more allergic, depressed, and fragile. None of these traits are of any benefit to us. They aren't making us stronger or faster or more resilient. But at the same time, they aren't really stopping us from breeding. Harvard anthropologist Daniel Lieberman coined a name for this kind of regressive change. He called it disevolution. And to a large extent, this disevolution explains why humans have also become such poor breathers. In other words, we weren't always this way. Just a few centuries ago, our mouths and our sinuses and our airways were vastly different. They allowed us, in many ways, to breathe more easily. I visited the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania to see how we'd changed. The museum contains one of the largest collections of pre-industrial skulls in the world. The lead curator there, Janet Monge, showed me a few dozen different ancient human skulls, and every single one of them had these powerful jaws, these wide faces, and these broad mouths. Monge pointed out something else. These skulls had perfect teeth. The skull you see here is not some rarity. Monge told me that she'd never seen a hunter-gatherer with crooked teeth. Not one of them. This was true for all humans all over the world, in India, Africa, China, Europe, South America, and more. The further back in time you went, to 5,000 years old, 50,000 years old, 150,000 years old, you'd see even more powerful jaws, even wider nasal passages, even bigger mouths. You'd see universally perfectly straight teeth. Here's the jaw of one of the oldest human skulls. It's about 300,000 years old. Notice its teeth, perfectly straight. Even older, 1 million years ago, our skulls looked like this. Notice the huge nasal cavity here. This very wide and powerful forward-growing face. Again, straight teeth. The skull you are seeing now is about 8,000 years old. Still, this very large, powerful jaw, forward-growing face, straight teeth. Now, look at how our skulls look about 2,000 years ago. Notice how much smaller the jaw is getting, how the face is more narrow. Still straight teeth, but things are getting tighter. Here is how we look today. Almost like another species. Very narrow jaw, a small mouth, very slender face. With a mouth this small, teeth no longer fit. They have to fight for space, so they grow in crooked. 90% of us now have some sort of misalignment or malocclusion in our teeth. This is why we need extractions and braces and headgear and all of that. Our teeth no longer fit in our too small mouths. There's another problem in having a mouth that's too small for its face. It's given humans a different kind of profile. What you're seeing now is a typical profile of an ancient skull. Almost every single skull measured at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology was found to be ahead of that perpendicular line, what's called a prognathic profile. But in the last 300 or 400 years, our profiles have been receding. 90% of the human population now has a face that grows behind that perpendicular line, called a retrognathic profile. There's a more serious issue to having this retrognathic profile than just aesthetics. It's shrunken our airways. A smaller mouth and flatter face means less room to breathe. This is why so many of us have such a hard time getting air in and out of our bodies. Beyond a few breeds of bulls, pugs, or other highly inbred brachycephalic dogs, modern humans are the only species to consistently share these traits. We are perhaps the only mammals in the history of life on Earth to have chronically crooked teeth. These researchers told me something else. If I didn't believe any of this, all I needed to do was look at animals in the wild. So, of course, I did. I looked at chimps. They all have perfectly straight teeth. I looked at Berberaf macaques, straight teeth. Dolphins, straight teeth. I looked at my mutt of a dog, straight teeth. Meanwhile, this is what we're stuck with. And if we don't do anything about it, we can end up looking like this. This is how we became the worst breathers in the animal kingdom. So much for survival of the fittest. All of this brings up a larger question. Why? Why did this happen to us, and what caused it? How could our mouths shrink and airways become so obstructed so quickly? I looked to the National Institutes of Health for answers. They provided a very clear answer. They said that crooked teeth were mostly inherited. We get them from our parents. Great. But that does nothing to explain why our ancestors just a few hundred years ago were so well formed and why the vast majority of us today are so messed up. I became pretty obsessed with tracking this down, and so I wanted to see more skulls. Specifically, I wanted to see the turning point when our faces fell apart on a mass scale. I wanted to do this to really get my head around this subject. And in order to do this, I needed to get my hands on some skulls. Old ones and lots of them. I called some friends at a foundation which shall remain nameless, the Long Now Foundation. And one of them told me my best chance of stumbling upon a large trove of centuries-old skulls was to fly to Paris and crawl 60 feet below the Garden of Luxembourg. Down there, within 170 miles of old limestone quarries, was one of the largest graveyards on Earth. 6 million skeletons dating back from a couple thousand years to a couple hundred years. So I arrived in Paris and was put in contact with some freelance urban explorers. They were 3 women in pantsuits, and they called themselves cataphiles. They'd spent years mapping out the underground passageways and claimed to know the location of an ancient ossuary filled with a few thousand victims of a cholera epidemic that ravaged Paris in 1832. This was the time in Western history when small mouths, crooked teeth, and obstructed airways became the norm throughout Paris and much of industrialized Europe. These cataphiles had spent countless days and nights exploring where there were no tourists, no descriptive plaques, no ropes, no lights, and no rules, where nothing was off limits. To be clear, this wasn't the most legal thing I've ever done. After an hour of climbing and digging through caves and hallways, we reached an enormous pile of fibulas, ribs, and jaws. Bones, all of them human, and skulls, hundreds and hundreds of them. I'll admit, I was very much a novice at inspecting skeletons, but there really was a clear difference in the shape and symmetry of these skulls from the 1800s compared to the hunter-gatherers and other ancient indigenous populations I'd seen before. These were the patient zeros of the modern obstructive face. I left Paris mildly haunted. To think that we've been so perfect for so long and then just devastated by this disevolution in a relative blink of an eye. But then again, why? What was it that changed in the 1800s to cause all of this damage? I still didn't know. And I wasn't the first person to wonder. It turned out that dozens of scientists from all over the world have been asking the same question for hundreds of years. I started pouring through their research, trying to piece together the story of our breathing and how it all went so wrong. For much of the past 2 millennia, the commonly held belief was that disease, deformities, and other ailments were caused by some sort of toxic exposure of some noxious and dirty stuff infiltrating our bodies and making us sick. The ancient Romans had a name for it. They called it miasma, which meant bad air. They believed miasma emanated from the ground or from the breath of snakes and other poisonous animals. If we were exposed to too much of it, we might get a skin disease or bubonic plague. Maybe we'd get leprosy or crooked teeth. So human sickness was spread through these huge clouds of poisonous air. This miasma theory stuck around until around the late 1700s, when a Dutch drape shop owner named Antony van Leeuwenhoek began collecting glass lenses in a metal tube, constructing the first super powerful microscope. Leeuwenhoek intended to use this device to inspect the thread he was selling in his shop. But after a while, he got curious and began inspecting other stuff: skin, sperm, wood pulp, insects, and rainwater. He noticed something extraordinary. Festering within substances were these little organisms. He called them little animals, or animalcules. Leeuwenhoek determined that yes, our bodies were being infiltrated by toxins, and these substances were making us sick, perhaps even deforming us. But it wasn't miasma, it was these little evil animalcules. They would later get a different name. We would call them germs. So germ paranoia quickly spread throughout Europe, and people began covering their mouths and their bodies and their windows, anything to keep these little beasts away. But no matter how well populations cleaned themselves, no matter how many face masks they wore, people kept getting sick. And even stranger, whole populations started getting sick with new diseases nobody had ever seen before, that few had even heard of. City dwellers in England were among the hardest hit. In the 16 and 1700s, tens of thousands of children, men, and women began suffering from bendable bones. Babies were born that couldn't sit up or move. They couldn't really hold their heads up or even crawl. Many had deformed jaws and mouths and had difficulty just getting a breath in and out. One doctor at the time wrote, "Their bones were flexible like wax that is rather liquid, so that the flabby and toneless legs scarcely sustain the weight of the superimposed body." This new disease seemed to affect the rich more than the poor. King Charles of England suffered from it, and later his daughter would die of it. Deformities of the bones became so common that the condition would be referred to as the English disease. It would later be called rickets. The king blamed rickets on Britain's damp climate, but Britain's climate hadn't changed. It was as damp and dreary and awful as it had always been. What had changed was the English diet. Around this time, at the dawn of the industrial age, a whole host of new technologies were developed to process food more quickly and cheaply. Roller mills and later steam mills ripped the germ and bran from wheat, leaving only a soft white flour. Meats and fruits and vegetables were canned and bottled. Sugar, which was once a prized commodity of the wealthy, became increasingly common and inexpensive. For the first time in human history, humans could spend their entire lives eating nothing but processed food. Nothing fresh, nothing raw, nothing natural. And millions did. And as they did, millions became sick with new mysterious ailments. All the while, the human face began rapidly deteriorating. Mouths shrank and facial bones grew stunted. Dental disease became common, and the incidence of crooked teeth and jaws increased tenfold. Our mouths got so bad, so overcrowded, that it became common to have teeth removed altogether. These maladies affected not just England, but cities throughout continental Europe. Really anyone who subsisted on this new diet of bottled, processed, industrialized food. Meanwhile, while all of this awfulness was going on in continental Europe, people living in Asia were suffering from yet another entirely new and strange disease. It too started with a shortness of breath. Then a numbness would take over the hands and feet. Legs would become paralyzed, the mouth would become grossly deformed, and teeth would fall out. This disease was called beriberi, named after the Sri Lankan Sinhalese words for weak, weak, or I cannot, said twice to add emphasis. By the early 19th century, beriberi was responsible for 35% of all sicknesses in Asia. A quarter of the Japanese Navy was afflicted, and more than 1 million people in the region would die. Like rickets, it too was believed to have been spread by germs. But eventually researchers found the real culprit. Once again, it was industrialized food. Advances in industrial milling made it quick and cost-effective to remove the germ and bran from rice, leaving only the starchy white seed. White rice was considered better tasting and of higher quality than the brown, chewy, pre-milled variety. It quickly became the staple of Asian diets. But this white rice was also deforming people and making them sick. What was making everyone so sick wasn't something in the rice. It wasn't germs. It was what the rice was lacking. Beriberi was a disease of deficiency. The bran and germ of rice contained something called thiamine. Thiamine would later be called a vital amine, or vitamin. It turned out that rice, bran, and germ was a rich source of vitamins, specifically vitamin B. Without sufficient levels of B, the muscles and nerves can't function properly. Teeth would become crooked and mouths would deform. Breathing would become labored. The exact ingredient removed during industrial milling was vitamin B. Rickets was also a disease of deficiency. But the missing ingredient causing all of those bendable bones and mashed mouths was vitamin D. The richest forms of vitamin D were found in butter, fish oils, or suet, all foods that had been removed in the modern diet. Animal bodies can also make vitamin D, but they need regular exposure to sunlight. In smoggy, soot-filled London and other industrialized cities throughout Europe, sunlight was in short supply. And even when the sun did shine, modesty required that populations be covered from head to toe. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, vitamins B, C, and D were distributed via supplements or juices or other nutrient-rich sources. Incidence of beriberi throughout Asia quickly plummeted, then practically disappeared, as did rickets. This was the age of vitamins, one of the greatest revolutions in medical history. This new understanding of nutrition enabled us to blunt, then almost entirely kill off so many epidemics which had plagued humans for hundreds and hundreds of years. Hooray for vitamins. And yet something wasn't quite right. No matter how much orange juice we drank, no matter how much sun exposure we got, our mouths just kept getting smaller and smaller. Our teeth kept growing more crooked, and our breathing became more obstructed and labored. By the 1920s, a Cincinnati-based dentist and researcher by the name of Weston Price was seeing it firsthand. Each new generation of kids he treated were suffering from worse and worse dental disease and crooked teeth. Price's own son would die after a dental procedure, and still nobody knew why. Price dedicated the rest of his life to finding out, but Price took a different approach. Working alongside a National Geographic researcher and explorer, Price compiled more than 15,000 print photographs, more than 4,000 slides. He compiled saliva and food samples and a library of detailed notes. The same story played out no matter where he went. Societies that had replaced their traditional diet with industrialized foods suffered up to 10 times more cavities, severely crooked teeth, obstructed airways, respiratory issues, and overall poorer health. The modern diets were all the same: white flour, white rice, jam, sweetened juice, canned vegetables, and processed meats. The traditional diets were all different. He traveled to the Swiss Alps and visited villages where the locals ate a diet that consisted almost entirely of hand-milled bread and homemade raw milk cheese. He traveled to the Scottish Isles, where the populations ate mostly fish and oatmeal. To Alaska, where communities subsisted almost entirely on seal, fish, and lichen. Deep inside Melanesian islands, he found tribes whose meals consisted of pumpkins, pawpaws, coconut crabs, and sometimes long pigs, also known as humans. Some cultures ate nothing but meat, while others were mostly vegetarian. Some relied primarily on homemade cheese, while others consumed no dairy at all. Their teeth were almost always perfect. Their mouths were exceptionally wide, their nasal apertures broad. They suffered from few, if any, cavities and dental disease. Respiratory problems like asthma or even tuberculosis, Price reported, were practically non-existent. While the foods in these diets may have all varied, they all contained the same high amounts of vitamins and minerals, from 1.5 to 50 times that of modern diets. All of them. Price became convinced that the cause of our shrinking mouths and obstructive airways was deficiencies not just in B or C or D, but of all essential vitamins. Vitamins, after all, often work in symbiosis. One needs the other to be effective. This explained why supplements could be useless unless they were in the presence of other supplements. We needed the full spectrum to develop strong bones throughout the body, especially in the mouth and face. By 1939, Price published Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, a 500-page doorstop of data that he collected during his travels. It was a, quote, masterpiece of research, according to the Canadian Medical Association Journal. Ernest Houghton, a Harvard professor, called it one of the epical pieces of research. But others hated it. They couldn't comprehend that these so-called primitive people had somehow shared in systems of health that were far superior than those in the modern world. In the end, Price turned out only to be half right. Yes, vitamin deficiencies might explain why so many people eating industrialized foods were sick, but they couldn't fully explain the sudden and extreme shrinking of the mouth and the blocking of airways that had swept through modern societies. Even if our ancestors consumed a full spectrum of vitamins and minerals every day, mouths would very likely still grow too small. What was true for our ancestors was also true for us, because the problem had less to do with what we were eating than how we ate it. Chewing. It was the constant stress of chewing that was lacking from our diets, not specifically vitamins A, B, C, or D. 95% of the industrialized diet was soft. Our ancient ancestors chewed for hours a day, every day. And because they chewed so much, their mouths, their teeth, their throats, and their faces grew to be wide and strong and pronounced. This larger mouth with straighter teeth allowed them to breathe more easily. Food in industrialized societies was so processed that it hardly required any chewing at all. Here's some of the industrialized mush that I grew up eating. Yes, of course I had extractions. Yes, of course I needed braces and headgear and everything else. Here's the typical modern American diet today. Cheese sauces, baked goods, spaghetti, fried roots, it's all soft. Even what's considered healthy foods, smoothies, yogurt, avocados, oatmeal, it's all soft. Healthy chewing starts in infancy. The chewing and sucking stress required for breastfeeding exercises the masseter and other facial muscles and stimulates more bone growth, allowing for that upper palate to drop, which leads to wider airways. Till a few hundred years ago, mothers would breastfeed infants up to 2 to 4 years, sometimes even longer. The more time infants spent chewing and sucking, the more they'd increase their chances of breathing better later on in life. With industrialization came bottle feeding and baby formula. Soon, in many societies, infants were hardly breastfed at all. Now, dozens and dozens of studies in the past 2 decades have supported this claim. They've shown lower incidence of snoring and sleep apnea in infants who were breastfed longer versus those who were bottle fed. This is why so many of the skulls that I'd examined in the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, that I'd seen at the Paris quarries, this is why they had narrow faces and crooked teeth. It's one of the main reasons why so many of us today are chronically stuffed up, why our airways are clogged, why we need sprays and pills and surgery just to get a fresh breath of air. A couple weeks ago, I was corresponding with Dr. Kevin Boyd. He's a pediatric dentist and biological anthropologist in Chicago. Boyd has spent years working with Dr. Mariana Evans at the University of Pennsylvania trying to more deeply understand how our mouths have changed through the lack of chewing and how this has changed our breathing and our health. They've spent a lot of time examining fetal skulls. Boyd shared with me some of his research. Here are some pre-industrial fetal skulls from around 200 to 300 years ago. These fetuses were from around 18 to 32 weeks old. You'll notice that profile, that prognathic growth, that pronounced jaw, that wider face. Now on the left is another pre-industrial fetal skull. And on the right, a very typical modern skull at around the same stage of development. Notice the difference in profiles. Notice on the right that retrognathic growth, the receding jaw, the smaller mouth, all of the hallmarks of a modern obstructed airway. Again, another modern skull. And another. You get the idea. Our clogged airways and too small mouths are now heritable traits. They are getting passed down and appear to be becoming more pronounced with every new generation. In other words, most modern humans are screwed right out of the gate. This helps explain why so many infants snore, why they suffer from sleep apnea, and as a result, why so many kids now are afflicted with ADHD and other chronic health issues. They can't breathe, and if they can't breathe, they can't sleep. And if they can't sleep and breathe properly, cognitive and skeletal development takes a big hit. But I didn't research the ever-shrinking mouth and human disevolution just to dwell on the negative. I wanted to uncover the core underlying problems of our breathing so that we could understand them, so that we could better diagnose them and do something about it, so we could find ways of fixing our breathing and improving our health. And luckily, I discovered that so much of this disevolution in our mouths and airways is reversible. There's a sweeping movement in dentistry right now focused on straightening teeth while also widening our too small mouths. So many patients with sleep apnea or snoring, even allergies and asthma, have had their issues go away once they could breathe normally again. By widening the mouth to the size it was supposed to have been, we can also return to that prognathic profile. As an experiment, I wore a device that stimulated chewing stress and minimal palatal expansion at night in an attempt to fix my own obstructive breathing. After a year, I developed about 15 to 20% more space in my airways. Now, the irony isn't lost on me with all this. How odd it is today that we are using industrialized technologies to restore ourselves to the way we were supposed to have been hundreds of thousands of years before industrialized technologies damaged us. But life is a paradox, and what are you going to do about it? Not all of us need such procedures to restore our breathing. For some of us, our airways are just fine. We're suffering from other poor breathing habits due to other environmental factors like polluted air, or constant stress, or poor posture. Correcting these inputs is even more simple. Sitting and standing straight allows more air to enter our lungs more easily. I found a researcher who'd actually used breathing to straighten scoliotic spines. These methods are now being used at Johns Hopkins and other institutions. Breathing through the nose has innumerable benefits, and today up to 25 to 50% of the modern population habitually breathes through its mouth. This makes us more susceptible to snoring and sleep apnea and various respiratory problems. Mouth breathing actually impacts our ability to think. The solution here is even more simple. Just shut your mouth. By breathing through the nose, we can filter air, heat it, moisten it, and condition it. We get 20% more oxygen in nasal breaths than we do equivalent breaths through the mouth. So nasal breathing also helps protect us from viruses and other pathogens, which is especially important today. It's really our first line of defense. With a bit more effort, we can learn breathing practices to hack into our nervous systems, to heat ourselves, and to heal ourselves even more. Some practices have been shown to blunt, or in some miraculous instances, effectively cure a laundry list of modern maladies like autoimmune diseases, asthma, and anxiety. So none of this should really come as too much of a surprise. The ancients have been writing about the power of breathing for thousands of years. Almost every major religion and dozens of ancient cultures, from the Greeks to the Buddhists, the Hindus to the Native Americans, celebrated breathing as a medicine. Indian yogis train themselves to decrease the amount of air they take in at rest, not increase it. They'd adjust the air coming in through different nostrils to elicit different physiological responses. The history of these practices goes back around 4,000 years. The ancient Chinese wrote 7 books entirely focused on breathing, all the bad things that would happen if we did it incorrectly, and all the benefits of doing it right. The Chinese called their system of conscious breathing Qigong, Qi meaning breath, Gong meaning work, or put together, breath work. A quote from the Tao reads, "Therefore, the scholar who nourishes his life refines the form and nourishes his breath." Isn't this evident? I think it's becoming more evident now. Just in the past decade, hundreds and hundreds of studies are showing clear, measurable benefits of adopting healthy breathing habits. A quick search on PubMed shows more than 46,000 research studies on how breathing affects the body and the mind. This work is being done at top institutions, and the vast majority of the data is confirming what so many of the ancients have said for so many thousands of years, that how we breathe really is a missing pillar of health. I only hope that this time around, we don't soon forget it. Thank you very much for your time.